I want to introduce our keynote speaker, Charles Marohn, who's the founder and president of Strong Towns. Academic training as a professional engineer and licensed in the state of Minnesota to put in curbs and gutters, roads, sewers, all sorts of things that make the world work. He has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the University of Minnesota's Institute of Technology and a master's degree in urban and regional planning from the University of Minnesota's Humphrey Institute. Chuck is the lead author of the Thoughts on Building Strong Towns, as well as author of A World-Class Transportation System. He hosts the Strong Towns podcast and is a primary writer for Strong Towns web content. He has presented on Strong Towns in hundreds of cities and towns across North America, including last year in Virginia down in Ashland. So he knows of what he speaks here in Virginia, and I hope you'll give him your best attention. Chuck?
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be here. The warm welcome and the warm weather. You laugh. I'm from central Minnesota, so this feels awesome. We were out for a walk the other day, and my daughters were saying how excited they were about the ice skating rink that was going to be built within a couple weeks by our house. So we had snow last week. It went away, but we're, any day now we will get that 6-month snow where it won't go away for 6 months. So yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's nice to come someplace warm. I'm gonna say right off the bat here, and I think having sat and met many of you and listened to the conversations today, I'm gonna frame my talk by just flat out saying at the beginning, I'm not a preservationist. I'm not a conservationist. I'm not someone who comes to this conversation through that door. I have learned that there's a lot of commonalities, a lot of common ground, that there's a lot of things that we can work on together. But my whole essence is not coming from that space. So I wanted to preface that, not to kind of kill the mood, but to help you see that there's another way to approach this conversation. I think the conversation here is very healthy and very robust and very good. I think there's another way to approach it too. And I think these two kind of merging of ideas can really kind of propel us beyond some of those frustrations that we have about communicating with each other, finding common ground, finding ways where we can do things across broad platforms of very, very different people. I am an engineer and a planner. I started my career doing city projects for cities all over central Minnesota, a lot of small towns, a lot of mid-sized places, building roads and streets and sewer systems and water systems. I realized at some point that I wasn't a very good engineer, and so I went back to graduate school and got a planning degree. In engineering school, we make fun of planners. In planning school, we make fun of engineers. Those jokes are both equally funny, but they come from very different kind of hemispheres of your brain. Planning is not a technical pursuit. Engineering is. So when I got done with school, I started to do planning work around Minnesota and at many of the same cities that I had done engineering work in. And I started to run up against just some financial things that started to knock me across the head. I had worked in one very small town, and we had gone and investigated this problem they had with their sewer system. Their treatment facility was overflowing, threatening to flood the river. I did a study, was out in the middle of the night pulling off manhole covers, found out that there was 300 feet of pipe that was settled, cracked in the water table and leaking, and that all that clean water was going out and threatening to overflow their treatment facility. The cost to fix this was around $300,000. I went to the city. I was so proud. I had isolated the problem. I had come up with a kind of a, very fine solution. We could fix this. They said, "That's fantastic, Chuck. That's 3 times our annual budget." It's a very small place. I was like, there's no way we could do this. And so, you're going to have to go get a grant of some type. You're going to have to go figure this out. So I went to the grant agencies. I went to the state. I went to the federal people. I went and talked to them. They said, Chuck, this sounds a lot like maintenance to us. We don't really do maintenance. That's not our department. Well, what do you do? Well, here's the kind of things we invest in. If you have environmental issues, if you're trying to create jobs, if you're building new stuff and expanding, that's the kind of stuff we like. I'm a smart guy. I went back to the city I was working for and I said, hey, if we want a grant, we got to make this project a lot bigger. So we came up with a $2.6 million project to expand the sewage treatment facility, put in a bigger pump, run pipe all over the place, hook up the poorest people that lived on the far outskirts of town. When I went back to the grant agencies, we checked every box. Pending environmental catastrophe, check. Serving underserved populations, check. Room for growth, check. We've hit every one. We were the #1 project in the state that year. We were given a $2.4 million grant from the state and federal government. The local share of that was $150,000. That was financed for them over 40 years at sub-market interest rates. I got a huge bonus for this from the company that I worked for at the time. The city actually had Chuck Marohn Day to celebrate what I was able to do for them. The grant agencies loved me. I was a hero. Understand what I had done. I had taken a city that didn't have enough money to maintain 300 feet of pipe. And I solved that problem by giving them 2.5 miles of pipe. I didn't actually deal with the underlying fundamental problem, which was not one of pending environmental catastrophe. That was a symptom of the problem. It wasn't one of, the city not being able to grow fast enough or having underserved populations or what have you. The fundamental underlying problem was that they could not afford their essential infrastructure. And to solve that, we gave them way, way more essential infrastructure. This is the core kind of conundrum that we're trying to deal with at Strong Towns. Back in 2008, as our economy was imploding, I started to write a blog. I started to write about the things that I had seen and experienced. We were having this crazy national conversation. It's kind of funny because at the time, the 2008 election season seemed insane. It seems so quaint now, looking back at it. But at the time, it felt crazy. And I remember thinking, nobody's talking about the things that I think are important. And so I started to write a blog to talk about cities, why they were financially struggling, why they were going broke. After a while, some friends of mine encouraged me to start a nonprofit. They actually filled out the paperwork and got it going. And a little while after that, we got a 501c3 and a foundation approached me and said, we think your work is fascinating. Come and tell us about your programs. I said, we don't have any programs. It's just me writing this blog. I wound up giving them a presentation, actually an early version of the presentation we're going to go through today. They gave me 3 years of startup money to leave my planning firm and to go out and share this message with as many places as I can. So since 2012, I've been traveling around the state of Minnesota, around the Midwest, around North America, sharing this conversation with as many people as I can. Our mission at Strong Towns is to support a model of development that allows our cities, towns, and neighborhoods to grow financially strong and resilient. The first part of my presentation is going to be an attempt to answer that question, why are cities struggling financially? And the second part will be, how do we do things differently today? One of the things I did early on at Strong Towns was to look at developments that I knew, projects that I understood, look at our existing development pattern and try to understand what was going on. This, for example, is a dead-end cul-de-sac. This is like the cheapest, simplest form of development you can have. It's just a dead-end road with a bunch of homes along it. No through traffic, no commercial traffic. When this was built, the property owners paid half the cost of this road. The city paid the other half. We looked at the taxes that the city was collecting from these property owners, the only one who really used this road in any meaningful way, and asked, how long is it going to take the city to recoup the money that they spent to build the road? The answer is 37 years. Now, the road's not going to last 37 years, but it's going to take that long for the city just to break even. These property owners are paying taxes with the assumption that when the road falls apart, the city will come out and fix it. Where's that money going to come from? Not from here. This is another development. This one is a closed loop system. There's a dead end cul-de-sac. Again, no through traffic, no commercial traffic. This is just a residential development. This was built in the 1980s. When it was built, the developer paid all the costs for the infrastructure. Developer put on all the roads and streets and curb and sidewalk and the pipes and the pumps and the valves, all that. Those costs, of course, were rolled over into the sale price of the homes. People have been including that in their property value for decades as they have paid their mortgages. They've also paid taxes and utility fees to the city under the idea that when everything falls apart, the city will go out and fix it. The road needed a maintenance project. The city went out and did that. The cost was $354,000. We asked the question, based on the taxes the city collects from the people who live within this development, the only people who really use this road in any meaningful way, how long is it going to take them to recoup the money they just spent to fix that road? The answer is 79 years. Now, let's say they wanted to try to collect between now and the time the road fell apart from these property owners enough money to fix just their road. What would that mean? It would mean an immediate 46% increase in taxes with annual increases of 3% over inflation every year for the next 25 years, with all that money going just to maintain the roadway. The sewer, the stormwater, all that stuff, vastly more expensive undertakings. This is just the road. Now, sometimes people say, okay, Chuck, we get it. This is the line I get from my fellow engineers. We get it. We know we lose money on residential. We make it up on commercial, right? Commercial's our cash cow. I don't know any corporation that loses money on 90% of what it does and tries to make it up on the last 10%. I don't know why a municipal corporation would think that is a smart business strategy. Nonetheless, we've kind of convinced ourselves that if we just have enough commercial growth, enough job creation, what have you, that we'll be okay. This is a business park. This is one of those build it and they will come kind of investments that cities like to make. It's got the wide industrial streets, the deep pipe. This was built in the mid-1990s in order to create growth and development and jobs in the community. Today, every single lot is built upon. The park is completely built out, as they say. The city felt this was so successful, they want to build another one just like it right next door. We said, okay, if we built the same thing for the same price and got the same amount of investment, would this be a good project? In today's dollars, there's $2.1 million it would cost to build it. There's $6.6 million of tax value in that park. Now, pause for a sec. Of the value that's in that existing park, 4 of the lots belong to a church. 2 of the lots belong to the school district. It's their bus maintenance building. 1 of the lots is a city maintenance garage. 1 of the lots is a county maintenance garage. These are all really important public facilities, right? We need schools. We need churches. We need maintenance buildings. None of them pay any taxes to the city, 0. Of the remaining properties, the ones that theoretically would be taxpayers, every single one was given a long-term tax subsidy in order to attract them to move into this park. For the sake of our analysis, and we tried this every different way that we could, the only way we could make the numbers come close to working was to assume the following. Within 12 months of this new park being built, every single lot would be developed by a full tax-paying, non-subsidized entity, and that every penny of tax revenue would go to retiring that bond that the city took on to build the park. If that were the case, it would still take almost 3 decades, 29 years, for the city to break even. That's 29 years where everybody else's taxes would need to go up to pay to sweep the streets, mow the ditches, provide police and fire service, and all the other things that are needed to make that work. And that's in the most wildly optimistic scenario. When I first met with that foundation, I had about 2 dozen of these that I went through. I was very proud of them. I was kind of a zealot about it. I just kept going on and on. At a certain point, when you do that, people just start to cry. And I found over time that I can make the point with just 3 charts. I am a professional engineer. I think in my licensing, it requires me to show you some charts. So there's 3 charts. These will not be painful. If you're not a chart person, just follow with my narrative. I'll walk you through it. Let's pretend that a developer comes to our community and says, I have a piece of property here I would like to build upon. I will, at my expense, put in all the commercial buildings. I'll put in all the residential homes. I'm not asking for any variances. I'll follow all your rules. I'm not asking for any handouts. I will, at my expense, put in all the required roads and streets and curbs and sidewalks. I'll put in all the pipes and the pumps and the valves and the meters. I'll do that all to your standard. The only thing that I'm asking as a developer is when I get done making this huge investment in your community that you, the public, right, the local government, you agree that you will take over the long-term responsibility to service and maintain this stuff. What would we say? Well, there's a lot of public officials I know in this room. You would jump up and down and say, yeah, you mean we spend nothing? You spend everything? We get all this growth and this new tax base? It costs us nothing? Of course we do that. That's fantastic. That's the ideal scenario. But let's say we're smart people. We're prudent. We've heard of this strong town stuff. We want to do the right thing. So what we're going to do is when this money comes in from this new development, we're going to take the portion that would normally get siphoned off and spent in other parts of the community, fixing and maintaining stuff. We're just going to take that and we're going to set it aside. And every year when that money comes in, we're going to take that portion, we're going to set it aside, and we're going to allow that to accumulate until we get out into the future and have to make good on this promise we made that we're going to fix and maintain stuff. This is what that looks like from a cash flow standpoint. On the very far left of the diagram there, you see year 1. In year 1, the development's brand new. It hasn't cost you a thing. The money comes in, you take that portion and you set it aside. In year 2, a little bit more money comes in and you add to what you had in year 1. In year 3, you add a little bit more, year 4, and on and on and on. And you can see a 5-year-old road isn't costing you anything. A 10-year-old sidewalk isn't costing you anything. A 15-year-old pipe isn't costing you anything. So year after year after year, the money comes in and you just accumulate this wealth. You get a couple decades out, you've got a huge pot of money. You're feeling very, very rich. The problem happens when you have to make good on that promise. And when you look at that, what you see is that the cumulative amount of money you brought in is insufficient. And from a cash flow standpoint, you run far, far into the negative. Now, cities aren't one development, right? Cities are a collection of developments, a series of neighborhoods. So let's say that our developer comes back in a couple of years later and says, you know, that development worked really well for you. It worked really well for me. I would like to do a similar size development. And every other year from this point forward, a developer comes in with a similar size development. In other words, the ideal scenario for any community, nice, steady, continuous growth. And we take that money and we set it aside and we save it for the day when we have to make good on all these promises we're making as we grow and develop. Here's what that looks like. In year 1, you've got your first development. It pays in for the entire 25 years shown here. Year 3, you add a second. Year 5, year 7, on and on and on. And you can see, not only do you have all this money from all this growth coming in, not only do you not have any expenses at all, your cash actually starts to kind of accelerate upwards. You're feeling very, very rich. You're doing really, really well. You're experiencing lots and lots of growth. And when you get to year 25 and you have to make good on that very first project you did back in year 1, you got to make good on that promise. Yes, you got to spend a little bit of money, but it's not a big deal, right? You've had all this growth. The growth creates what we call the illusion of wealth. Because as we all intuitively understand, if you lose money on every transaction, you don't make it up in volume. If you lose money over the long term on every project that you do, the further you go out in time, the more downward pressure there is on your budget. This is the answer to that question, why are cities struggling? Why, despite all the initiatives at job creation and infrastructure building and growth, why after all the tax subsidies and all the things we've done to stimulate our economy, all the debts we've taken on, all the rules we put in place to make sure this worked out well, why every city in this country is struggling to do basic things. Keep police and firefighters employed. Keep the streetlights on overnight. Keep the library open past 4:30. Why can we find millions of dollars to expand a highway and we can't find $500 to put in a crosswalk? It's because we live way out on the far end of that curve. I'm from Minnesota. One of my fellow Minnesotans, a guy named Tom Friedman, writes for the New York Times. You've probably all read him at one point or another. I'm from Minnesota. We're all above average. He's written some very important and influential books. One of his books, it might have even been his most recent one. That was the one just prior to that. It's called That Used to Be Us. And it was kind of a lament about, here's all the great things that America used to do that we no longer do. Here's all the great things that used to be us. And one chapter is on infrastructure. And he looked back at a period of time and he said, that used to be us. Now it's China. Now it's Dubai. Now it's all these other places. That used to be us. We used to have the best infrastructure in the world. We used to have the greatest stuff around. We used to have the nicest roads. We used to have the nicest bridges. Now it's all falling apart. What happened? What happened? It didn't make us wealthy. We didn't actually create enough wealth to actually take care of it all. And when you don't create enough wealth to actually take care of the stuff that you're building, eventually you can't maintain it. Eventually it falls apart. Do you recognize, I want to take this and create some kind of dialogue bridges here. And I want to do it this way. Do you recognize yourself in this chart here? Do you recognize your own behavior at all? Because oftentimes in our political debates and in our cultural conversations, when we see problems that crop up, we find a way to blame like the other team, right? This is their fault. They did this, they did that. This is why people smoke, right? This is why you'll go home tonight and instead of going for a walk or going to the gym, you'll sit and have a bowl of ice cream and watch TV, right? Oh, this is a good baseball game, game 7. Oh, this is really interesting. I like this. And then, heart disease, right? We are wired as humans to highly value positive feedback today and to deeply discount the negative pain in the future. This is a human flaw, okay? That we all share, all of us, me, you, all of us share this human flaw. One of the very interesting things about the American development pattern, which when I was a young engineer and I would ask hard questions about why do we do things this way, I was told repeatedly, well, this is the way things have always been done. This is the way we do them, Chuck. It's important to understand how huge of an anomaly this way of building is. We have embarked over the last 70 years on a huge experiment, an experiment that rearranged not only how we live and how we get around, but how we communicate with each other, how we start businesses, how we trade, how we fall in love, how we create art. The implications of this shift, in some ways, cannot be overstated. I want you to look at, go ahead, go to the next slide here. There we go. This city here. This is my hometown. This is Brainerd, Minnesota. This is what it looked like back in 1904. One of the things I love about being in Virginia when I have the ability to come here is the historical perspective, because I have one of the longest resident families in my hometown. I grew up on the farm that was homesteaded by my great-great-grandparents. So when I pull in here and I drive by the grave site over here, it's like, wow, I actually live up the street from where my grandmother is buried, and she's buried in like a plot of family members. And my grandfather and grandmother are buried in this other cemetery over here. And again, like lots of Marohns there. And it's very interesting because I have this deep history. My original Scandinavian ancestors moved there in the early 1900s. So it's fascinating when I come here and get this like deep historical perspective. When we look at this photo here, to me, the first time I saw this, I was blown away. I had a hard time recognizing this place because this is the city that my ancestors would have understood, but that was completely foreign to me. I'm a planner. I get into like the planning geek stuff. So I look at this photo and I look at the way the buildings line up perfectly, the way they frame the public realm at just the right ratios of height to width. The buildings themselves have great symmetry. They front the street in a beautiful way. This is a gorgeous street. This is a beautifully designed Midwestern town street. I'm going to ask some tough questions now about this street here. How thick was their zoning code? How many boards and committees did these people have to go to build something? How many state grants did they get? How many federal subsidies did they get? How much infrastructure did they build to induce this growth? How much tax subsidy did they give out? How many regulations did they put in place? We can go through the litany of things that we have convinced ourselves are absolutely essential to building successful places. These people had none of them. None. Zero. They didn't even have 30-year mortgages. These were a bunch of illiterate lumberjacks in the middle of nowhere. Look at the magnificent street they built. How did they do this? It's really simple. They copied what they knew worked. They took a development pattern and a development style that they had seen work around the world for thousands and thousands of years. One based on small incremental growth, incremental steps over a broad area over a long period of time. They took the materials they had on hand and they copied that style. After decades of growth initiatives, of all the things we do to create successful places, after all the zoning codes and planning commission meetings, after all the subsidies, all the grants that we've given, all the things we've done to create jobs and economic development, here's what this street looks like today. Yeah, it's from the exact same spot. This street is a wasteland of parking and half-occupied buildings. And if you want to understand in a snapshot why our cities everywhere of all sizes struggle financially today, understand there's $500,000 of public infrastructure invested in that street. Where is the wealth that sustains that decade after decade, generation after generation? We have to start having a conversation about how we build places that are financially productive, financially strong and resilient. We have been so rich, so wealthy. It seemed like that kind of stuff doesn't matter. I was given a lecture at a university in Boise, Idaho, and I got to this slide and a student raised their hand, stood up, said, "Chuck, I'm from Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a very poor country. When we build, we have to build one block at a time. And before we build the next block, we have to make sure that every gap is filled in on the block we just built. Otherwise, we won't be able to afford it. We're a very poor country. We can't afford to build this way." We're a very poor country now, too. We can't afford to build this way either. And for a long period of time, that illusion of wealth made us think that this kind of thing didn't matter. That we could just run roads wherever we wanted them. We could just put in bridges and overpasses. We could just build subdivisions. And we never had to worry about maintaining anything. We never had to worry about taking care of it because everything we did just made us feel rich, made us feel wealthy. We now live with decades and decades and decades of accumulated liabilities. And we've got to figure out a way to become more productive. There's some lessons in this from the way people used to build cities. And I'm going to say this now. I took out some of my slides because I had a finite amount of time, and we want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. One of the slides I took out is kind of walking us through this notion of the way things used to be built. I want to just reiterate, because I'm going to go into this here in a second. There's no part of me that thinks we should go back to, the early 1900s. We shouldn't go back to burn barrels and manure in the street and latrines out back. But what we have to do is we have to use the approach that they use to solve problems to actually solve these problems. What was the approach that our ancestors, and I say that in the broadest, widest possible sense of the term, our ancestors around the world, different continents, different latitudes, different cultures for thousands of years, used to build their places? It was the idea of building incrementally over time. Look at this photo here. Do any of you have any clue what city this is? If you look at it, what you will see is that this could literally be any city in North America that was founded and built prior to this new experimental way we have of building cities. Any city that was founded and began before 1930 started just like this. Richmond started like that. Washington, D.C. started like that, right? Manhattan, Boston, Atlanta, they all started just like that. We can go west across the country: Kansas City, St. Louis, Chicago, Minneapolis, Seattle, Vancouver, San Francisco, Los Angeles. They all began as a series of little pop-up shacks, some hopes and some dreams. We built thousands of these across this continent. And for a variety of complex reasons that defy our ability to predict, to project, or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places failed. What happens when a place like this fails? Does the stock market plummet? Does unemployment skyrocket? Do we have to have an emergency session of Congress to bail out Wall Street? No. These are little bets, little experiments. A few people lose a little bit of money, they salvage what they can, they move on to the next place. We built thousands of these across this continent. And for a variety of complex reasons that defy our ability to predict, to project, or even to fully understand after the fact, a lot of these places were successful. And when they were successful, they would grow in a very simple way. They would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. And so this street, which was built in 1870, is when this photo was taken, 34 years later would become that street I showed you earlier. That's my hometown. Go ahead, please, to the next slide. And after another 40 years of incrementally growing up, incrementally growing out, and incrementally becoming more intense, these 2- and 3-story wood structures would become buildings of brick and granite. The way civilizations have built wealth for all of human history up to modern times, the way cities build wealth is by making modest investments over a broad area over a long period of time. We don't go to the casino and put it all on red. We don't go try to make some big transformative thing here that will trickle down to everything else. We make modest investments over a broad area over a long period of time. And it's funny because when I say that, don't you exhale a little bit? Don't we all intuitively understand that this is how the world works? We do. Let me show you how powerful this approach to development is. These are 2 identical blocks in my hometown. I've labeled the one on the left old and blighted. I've labeled the one on the right shiny and new. It's okay. It's happened to me before. These blocks are identical in every way, except for the development pattern. They're the same size, the same area. They have the same amount of public infrastructure. They're in the same thoroughfare, the same neighborhood. Everything about them is the same, except for the style of what's built upon them. That old and blighted block looks like this, I hope. In the 1920s, as my city was growing incrementally, the next increment of out were these 3 blocks. What you're looking at here is the commercial equivalent, the commercial pop-up shack equivalent of the 1920s. So I showed you that 1870s pop-up shack. This is what the same thing looked like in the 1920s. This was the far edge of town. The people who built these hoped that in time, the city would continue to grow. They would have second and third stories here. There would be buildings become more intense, more ornate. Of course, that's not what happened. What happened was these were built. We had the Great Depression. We had World War II. And then a new development pattern that just skipped right over this and started building out on the edge. These places have stagnated for 90 years. 2 blocks over used to look just like this. The city had the buildings labeled blight and torn down. And then we have a new development, Taco John's drive-through. Where's my Minnesota friend? I met someone here. So there we go. Oh, you're a Minnesotan too. So you've experienced the glory of Taco John's. Yes? Yes? When you went to Franklin, we went to the same hometown. When you went to Franklin School, you walked over to Taco John's. This is the new Taco John's up the street. Taco John's is known for their potato olays, right? Which is a little like tater tot, maybe like cut in thirds. So it's like a thin with a ton of spice, like salt on it. In Minnesota, salt is a exquisite spice. Dipped in nacho cheese, just like they do in Mexico, right? So this is our Taco John's. We were so proud of this. We put it on the front page of our economic development, end of the year catalog. Look at what we were able to do. We got rid of this block of blight. We got something new. The new building meets all of our zoning code. It meets our setbacks. It meets our sign ordinance. We've got adequate parking. We got rid of the on-street parking so the traffic flows more smoothly. We got the environmental people who showed up, and they pacified them by putting native plants in the stormwater areas around the building. The bike walk people showed up. They got a sidewalk. The sidewalk only goes to the edge of the property line, but they got it in there. So everybody was thrilled because we checked every single box, right? Here's what nobody bothered to look at. That old and blighted block has a total value of $1.1 million. 2 blocks over, that shiny and new block, the same size area, the same amount of public infrastructure, so the same expense that we have as a community, yet that new building is only worth $800,000. Understand what you're looking at. You are looking at the traditional pattern of development, that incremental way that we build cities for thousands of years around the world. You're looking at it in its infant phase, after 90 years of neglect and decline. And it still outperforms by a wide margin the stuff we're building brand new today. And we all know what's going to happen to that taco place, right? 20 years from now, there'll be a new taco place up the road. This one will be a used car lot. 10 years later, it will be boarded up. We'll be trying to get some type of grant or subsidy to get it torn down and redeveloped. We've all seen this. On my way through town today, on the way out here, I saw this, right? We've all been around long enough to experience this. In fact, in the few years since this was built, here is, and you're going to have to hit like 3 things in a row. Here's what's actually happened to the property values. That old and blighted block is worth 79% more. It's paying 79% more property tax to the city. It employs more people. It has more local owners. Those businesses are using local banks, local insurance companies. They're advertising in a local paper. They've got floats in the local parade. None of that is true about the one on the left, which has 2 managers and a bunch of minimum wage employees. This is the kind of thing we do in the middle of our cities. We do the same thing out on the edge. This is go ahead and hit the next one. This is the 20-acre big box site out on the edge of town. This is the Mills Fleet Farm site. Mills Fleet Farm is, okay. People down here don't know about Mills, do they? It's an icon where we're from. It's like we're the home of Mills Fleet Farm. So Mills Fleet Farm, this is the biggest one in the world. It's a double-sized big box store. It's a Midwestern kind of Minnesota base. Like I said, my hometown is where it originated. Big box conglomerate. When you walk into a Mills Fleet Farm, you are going to be able to choose from auto parts, animal feed, lumber, guns and ammo, camouflage lingerie. That's the product mix in Mills Fleet Farm. These are wildly successful. We built them all over Minnesota. We have the biggest one in the world. This is a big box store, auto dealership, gas station. This is a 20-acre piece of property. It's the most valuable 20 acres in the entire area. When these people show up at a meeting, we just stop the meeting and ask them, like, what do you need, right? 20 acres of our downtown, in the core downtown of Brainerd. We've got 20 acres here. A different way of building. If you've seen the movie Fargo, you've seen a not so flattering, but not so inaccurate portrayal of the downtown of Brainerd. A place that has really struggled. In my lifetime, there's been nothing new built there. Plenty of buildings that have been torn down or burned down and are now parking lots. Most of the second and third stories are unoccupied. The first stories kind of struggle. But 20 acres in the core downtown. Out on the edge of town, that 20 acres has a total value of $0.6 million an acre. It's a huge sum of money in one spot. But when we go to that downtown, the same area, just a different style of development, a different way of assembling a place, you've got a value that's 78% greater. How much did we spend to get that development on the edge? We spent a couple $100 million on the bypass. We spent millions on frontage roads and backage roads. We spent $10 million just to get the sewer out to the corner of that property, millions more to extend it throughout there. How much did my generation spend to get that wealth in the downtown? Nothing. That's wealth that my great-great-grandparents and their contemporaries started to build slowly and incrementally over time, and then bequeathed to us as an endowment of sorts, something that would pay back generation after generation after generation. We've slowly milked it down. What happens, and I'm going to say this, and it's heretical for a Brainerd resident to say this, but I think you'll appreciate, what happens when Mills Fleet Farm goes out of business? It may be 5 months from now, 5 years from now, 50 years from now, but at some point it will happen, right? At some point, a business will have an end date, something will happen that will not be a Mills Fleet Farm anymore. What comes next on that big box store? What comes next? I don't know. But what we do know for sure is that whatever comes next is going to be lower on the economic food chain than what is there now. We can see this. We see when these places close, what comes next is a Salvation Army or a church or a warehouse. Whatever it is lower on the economic food chain. The one thing we can say for sure about that property is that today, that is the peak. The peak. There are 134 different properties in the downtown, in that 20 acres right there. What happens when one of them loses a tenant? Someone retires. Someone goes out of business. Someone outgrows their store and has to move to a different one. What happens? Well, these places can become many things. In my life, I've seen them become many things. These are very simple boxes that can change, evolve, adapt. If one day we wake up and we realize we have too much retail space, not enough office space, that conversion is really easy. We realize we have too much office space, not enough residential space. That conversion is very easy. You don't have to be a genius about the future when you build in a way that is adaptable and flexible. There's a reason why our ancestors, and again, I'll emphasize the largeness of that term, there's a reason why our ancestors around the world for thousands of years built in this way. It is adaptable, it is flexible, and financially, it is incredibly productive. I'm going to show you now, because I've shown you 2 sites, I'm going to show you some broader patterns across the landscape in some cities, because these sites I've shown you are representative of a broader trend that we see in cities we've modeled all over the country. There's a good friend of mine from Asheville, North Carolina named Joe Minicozy. He runs a group called Urban 3. They do this 3D modeling of financial productivity. What I'm going to show you, if you think of a farmer going out and spreading seed across the field, the parts of the field that grow the most robustly, we say that's the most productive part of the field. That's where you get the most bushels per acre or however you're measuring it. What I'm going to show you now is financial productivity. Where do you get the most value per acre in a city? And I'm going to start with Buffalo, New York. Buffalo, New York, if you've never been there, it's a wonderful place. I like Buffalo a lot. But no one is putting Buffalo on the top of America's most, exciting cities. Buffalo has lost population every single year since World War II. Every single year, it's been a loss of population. If you were to move to Buffalo today, they will sell you a house for $1 if you agree to live there for 5 years and fix it up. This is a desperately poor place that has had huge amounts of decline and disinvestment. Yet, if we look at Buffalo, New York, and we say, where's the most productive parts of the city? Can you point to me where their historic downtown is? And not only is it a repository of wealth, not only has it held its value despite decades and decades and decades of decline, but it absolutely dwarfs everything else around it. Here's a smaller city, mid-sized city in New York. We see the same kind of thing. Here's a very little town by where I live, about 1,200 people. When I first went there, they said, Chuck, we've got great stuff happening on the south side of town over here on the edge. We've got great stuff happening on the east side over on the other edge. It's these core neighborhoods that are horrible. We got to get these things torn down and rebuilt into something that is decent. And then we showed them where all their wealth is. And all those poor neighborhoods. And all the neighborhoods where the poor people live. These are trends that we see in every city that we've ever looked at. Big and small, mid-size, old, young. When we look back at that traditional development pattern, those places that were built incrementally over time, what we see is tremendous amounts of flexibility, adaptability, and alarming, just amazing amounts of financial productivity. When we look at the stuff that we have built over the last 60, 70 years, what we see is the opposite. We see fragility. We see places that struggle to adapt and change. And we see places that cost us more to provide service to than they will ever provide in tax revenue. Literally, the more we grow today, the poorer we become. I want you to look at a couple of these buildings because it points to a way we can start to address this problem, this set of challenges that we've created. These are in North Carolina. They could really be in any city. We see the same kind of numbers everywhere. Here's a Walmart at $384,000 an acre. Here's the Kmart's at that. The Walmart's at $967,000 an acre. These are seen as huge investments because it's under one big property. Yet when we look around the community, here's a supper club in the downtown. It's an old warehouse. It's been converted, $5 million an acre. And my favorite all-time, Jimmy's Pizza, $3.4 million an acre. Now, if you say, Chuck, this is so overwhelming. This is such a huge deal. Our cities are going broke. We can't fix all this stuff. I don't even know where to start. Look at that Jimmy's Pizza building. If you go out today and get out of your car and actually walk and experience the cities as we have built them, start at the far edge of town, walk straight through the middle to the other side, what you are going to be struck with is that our cities are nothing but gaps. Massive, massive gaps of nothingness. Do this once as an exercise for yourself so you start to grasp. I'm going to apologize to you when you do this because it is going to become an obsession for you. It's going to make you sick to your stomach to go places. Because do it as an engineer. And just for roughness, streets will vary in cost, but just so the numbers are easy, when you're going down a 2-lane street with sidewalks and curb and pipe, just count in your brain $1,000 a foot. Just walk and say $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, and then look at the wealth that does not exist. We have felt we are so rich that we didn't have to worry about that stuff. That now has to become our obsession, those gaps, that lack of productivity. And when you come to grips with the reality that our cities are nothing but massive, massive gaps, you have to ask yourself a question. Do we have the wherewithal? Do we have the capacity? Do we have the intelligence and the mental makeup to build something as refined and sophisticated as Jimmy's Pizza. Because if that's all we can do, look at the wealth we can start to build, right? In a country, in a continent that is nothing but gaps. Our cities used to be like this. We spread them out like this. In many places, we didn't even add population. We just took people we have now and spread them out. We said, if we increase our average daily traffic, we're winning. Why? It's the same people just driving around more. How is that helping anybody? If we build more pipe, we're winning. Why? If it takes 20 feet of pipe to provide you water service and now it takes 200 feet of pipe to provide you water, how is that winning? Especially if you're going broke in the process. When you start to grasp that Jimmy's Pizza is what winning looks like, it's the path towards winning. My wife loves to go to the YMCA. We live a few blocks away, and she gets up every morning and goes, or 3 days a week, 4 days a week, and goes. And it's interesting because if you go to the YMCA, and I don't go as often as I should, if you go, there's always that person, especially after like the first of the year, who shows up, who is really out of shape, really, really, really out of shape. And the thing that I have found really heartening about the YMCA, where I live, is how everybody who's there, who's been going for a while, kind of embraces that person. They walk in the door and they're like, showing up is like the first step, right? It's the first step. Our cities are that morbidly obese person. And the first step is Jimmy's Pizza. It doesn't look glamorous. It doesn't look fantastic. But if we spent the next 2 decades just building those, we wouldn't have to put in another foot of pipe, another foot of street, another foot of sidewalk, but we would be growing richer every day. And think about the opportunities that provides. We all understand who Jimmy is, right? Jimmy goes to church with you. He volunteers on the PTA. He sponsors a softball team. He banks at the local bank. He uses a local accountant. He advertises in a local paper. He's got a float in your 4th of July parade. That's a strong economic ecosystem. If we stop and look around, what we see is that our cities are dripping with investment opportunities. But they do not look like the investment opportunities that we have grown accustomed to. The tale of putting 1,100 condo units or whatever you were talking. This is, I think we will look back at this period of time as an absurdity that was ever something we pondered doing. The investment opportunities that lay there in front of us are so small that we pass them by. My city just did a $14 million sewer and water expansion out to the edge, to the airport, in the hopes of inducing growth and development and, all this stuff that would create prosperity for people. I went to the city engineer and I said, I think you could use a sidewalk here. Do you know what he said? Why would you say that, Chuck? You have poor people on the south side of town walking to the struggling grocery store on the north side of town, so many that they've worn a path through the ditch. Yet a poor, struggling city with high unemployment thinks that their best opportunity is not to make life a little bit easier there, but to spend 2 times the annual city budget to try to create some new growth out on the edge of town. Our investment opportunities today are small. We have become so obsessed with chasing the dollar out on the edge that we have ignored and missed the pennies, the nickels, and the dimes that are laying there waiting for us to pick them up. And if we can reorient ourselves to slow down, recognize these gaps, recognize these investment opportunities, recognize where people are struggling in our communities and the little tiny things it would take to address those struggles, not only can we put ourselves in a position to make investments that are going to benefit our cities, help us be more financially productive, make us strong and resilient again. But we cannot help but do it in a way where we actually improve people's lives. At the end of the day, that's what a Strong Towns approach is all about. Thank you so much for having me.